Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, where we dive deep into the rich and diverse history of the Caribbean and its diaspora. Today's episode focuses on something that's often overlooked, but incredibly powerful, our own family histories. Our conversation takes us on a unique journey, one of personal history, migration, and the power of storytelling. The act of recording our personal histories is a very important way to preserve the legacy of our ancestors and understand the historical and cultural forces that shape our lives. Today's guest has embarked on a journey documenting his own family's history, tracing the path from Jamaica to the UK. In this conversation, we'll explore why he chose to create such an audio project to tell this history, the challenges that he may have encountered, and why it's crucial for each of us to take ownership of our family's narratives. So, joining us today to delve into the ways in which personal histories intersect with broader historical context is creative consultant and creator of the experimental audio project Daylight Come, Calvin Walker. Calvin, thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about you? What inspired your interest in creating audio projects and other creative projects, and of course, your roots in the Caribbean?
Great. Thank you, Alexandra. Thanks for inviting me. So, my roots, I was born in Jamaica, St. Thomas. Stayed in Jamaica until I was 5 years old, and I was brought to England. And so it was quite dramatic at the time, like a traumatic break from, a child growing up in the West Indies, arriving in the UK in winter and just seeing white people for the first time. So that was just my sort of, complete sort of change of environment. And so I grew up and I had my roots in London because there was a big West Indian community at the time, which has kind of changed a little bit now. It's broader, it's more African. It's at the time when I grew up, it was really purely West Indian, so Jamaicans, Barbadians, Trinidadians, and it wasn't much more than that. And sort of over time, it's much more mixed today. So my roots sort of stayed from that point of view, and people were coming over in the 60s to join their relatives who had started coming over from the 50s. So there was like a really kind of lively community, and so that's how it started off in England.
We don't touch about this much, as we continue in the episode, but do you want to maybe share with us what sort of piqued your interest in sort of doing the creative consultancy work that you do around, Daylight Come, as we'll talk a little bit more, but just in general, perhaps?
Sure, sure. Well, basically at school, I was really interested in art. So at the end, when I left school, I was working as a kind of intern to learn the trade. And so it touched on art, photography, and then sort of I gradually found my way, worked for quite a while as a professional photographer. And then through that, there was a kind of natural kind of connection to multimedia at the time. And then from multimedia to filmmaking. So it was kind of a natural progression. And then I worked for almost 20 years at the French National Film Commission. So I left the UK, came to live in France, did various jobs in multimedia, and ended up for a long time. The longest period I ever worked was at the Film Commission. And so when I left the Film Commission, I carried on working as a consultant, basically doing the same kind of work, but independently, working with film commissions, not necessarily French related, UK, wherever. And so that's where I am today, working as a consultant. And also, I'm sometimes called in to work as a kind of critic for a design school, Parsons, which is Parsons, New York, but they have a French section, which is Paris, Parsons, Paris. So I get called in sometimes to critique, and that's really interesting.
And I'm sure I think that sort of lends us into Daylight Come, right? You've been doing multimedia work sort of externally, right? As you
Absolutely.
outlined for us. And what better way to sort of bring your own passion for multimedia work with your own family's history. And so I really enjoyed listening to Daylight Come and sort of bridging audio, which of course I love as a fellow podcaster, right? With Caribbean history, Caribbean family stories. I've always, sort of put it out there for listeners that if they do want to join us for an episode and talk about their family stories, that's certainly something that I welcome. So I was really intrigued to come across your project and, sort of the ways that it blends all of these things, right? Tell our listeners a little bit about Daylight Come in your own words and what inspired the idea to even, start this project and document your family's history in this way.
Sure. So basically, what happened was my mother passed away in 2011. I had an elder sister who had disappeared a long time before, sort of voluntarily complicated. And that's what happens with the community where people come from the Caribbean. There's kind of not very sort of settled the standard family units where the father, mother, whatever. And so I lost touch with the sister, and then I decided I'd try and find her when my mother passed away. And that was a long search process. And actually, it could be interesting for other listeners who sort of embark on this journey of trying to trace someone or write a family story. I actually called on the help of the Salvation Army, who have a family search section. So when it turned out that they had found out my sister had passed away, I kind of felt it was my duty to leave some kind of trace of her memory and the fact that there was kind of disconnect. And so once I decided to do that, that was kind of the hard part came following that sort of how do I do it? Do I write it? I'm not very good as a writer. I thought of doing like a short film. I did many attempts, it didn't work. I was never really satisfied. And also, the thing is, how much do you say? I had very little information about my sister. I knew I wanted to say something. And so basically, it grew organically from wanting to say something about her, leaving a trace, and bringing in the rest of the family for it to make sense of the context. And then the context of the family made sense to bring in the context of immigration, colonization, going back all the way to slavery. So it kind of suddenly grew like in waves. So once I had that kind of in my head, I was kind of lost on how I would put it down because I always liked sound and I couldn't work out exactly how I wanted to do it. I did several attempts of friends recording, didn't work. It didn't kind of, speak to me. And I just give you this little anecdote of how this kind of eureka moment arrived. So I cycle a lot near where I live in Paris, and I listen often to podcasts as I'm cycling with a little speaker attached to my handlebars. And so one day, as I'm listening to a podcast, I suddenly hear my emails being read out, my personal emails. And I'm thinking, what's going on? And so I realize that somehow as I'm writing, I jolt and some kind of setting triggers off automatic reading of my emails. What sounds kind of weird, but what actually made me realize that hearing these voices, the quality had improved a lot. And so I started exploring automated voices, generated voices, and suddenly I realized that was what needed. I needed to be able to find something that would speak the voices as I'm writing the text, but I could completely keep reworking, whereas I couldn't with a human being. I couldn't have an actor, voice actor, so I could just keep on practicing reworking. So I'd given up until that point. I'd given up on, writing it as a written story or as a short film or whatever. And so that suddenly made it possible. So that's how putting it together, sort of the source for the story, the method I use for making it, and how that sort of gelled together.
Well, I first want to say condolence for the losses of your mom and your sister.
Thank you.
But you definitely did, in a sense, touch on a question that I also had of you because I'm always interested, as somebody who also loves audio, but listening to it, I said, well, this could have been a book, like this could have been a short story, as you said, even film iterations of this project. As somebody who also loves audio, what were you particularly challenged by? You've walked us through why you chose not to pursue the other ventures in that way, but what were the challenges of pursuing an audio project as opposed to, different
Well,
elements?
the challenge is, first of all, which voices. So I didn't want to use my voice because it's too close to me. And that's what was really good with using the audio generated voices. So I could get some distance. And the fact that I ended up using like a female voice, which is, was simply because, first of all, it was the best one that could kind of get across the emotion that I needed. And then I liked it. So I just thought, why not keep it? So I ended up using that, and that gave me the distance I need to be able to relate the story. And I'd always grown up with radio when I was a child because we couldn't afford TV. And so I grew up reading with BBC, book at bedtime, all these kind of things. So that was really my kind of medium. So, when I found I could actually just write phrases and have it spoken, it was actually not very easy. In fact, it was really hard because getting the intonations that you want and the expression means a lot of work, but it meant it was actually doable, which was the key thing for me. So I, reworked it, rewrote it until I actually got to a point where I had something that worked.
Certainly. I do want to sort of set the scene for our listeners. We touched on a little bit about Daylight Come, primarily, as you mentioned for us, right? It walks us primarily from you and your family's migration from St. Thomas to the UK. But as you mentioned earlier, there obviously marks the surrounding moments around this time period, right? So you do walk us a bit from Jamaica's colonial history. Windrush is a part of this story, of course. You can't talk about Jamaicans in the UK and West Indians in the UK at large without talking about Windrush. Um, World War One and Two, a lot of elements that I, don't want to give away for our listeners by chance. But what were maybe, did you encounter any difficulties, I think, in gathering sort of these family histories? I think oftentimes we come from a culture that, isn't always so open to share in these ways, right? And so what was it like for maybe you to, on the side of actually like writing and producing this project beyond the, finding the voices, et cetera, but collecting the stories to document?
As you're saying that, the funny thing is, yes, there's that secretive side that sort of especially Jamaican women have. They're secretive for no reason. It's just like their nature. And so they're kind of whispering and whatever. And my mother, my aunt, and the family. And when you realize what they were talking about, it's like, why were they bothering to whisper? But the curious thing with my mum is I'm just realizing that she did actually tell me a lot in the early days when I first arrived in the UK, before my younger brothers and sisters came along. And so a lot of the source came from her and some from my aunt. So in the story, I speak a lot about my aunt who raised me. And so a lot of it came from them. So when I actually got to writing, especially they weren't around anymore. So it was a lot from the memory of them telling me in the beginning about, when they grew up in Jamaica, who the relatives were, who came over, who stayed. So luckily, I kind of, was enriched with all that they told me. So when I got to writing it, there was no one else really around. And a few people who were left, like some cousins, didn't know much at all, less than I thought they would know. So it was basically on my own and sort of putting it down, digging into my memory and putting pieces together. And so it basically came from that. And there was a few missing pieces that luckily one of the contacts that was helping me do family search, a lady called Lisa Hill at Anglia Research in the UK, she'd found a few missing pieces like names and dates of my great aunt in Jamaica and certain dates to help me put together who came over when and who stayed with who at what other time. But most of it, sorry to answer your question, is from my mother and my aunt in the days when they were giving of information until the tap turned off and it was like not so much coming forward, but it was rich anyway, what they left me.
Certainly, and I found it to be, I think, much to sort of what you're saying, oral histories are such an important part of our culture, right? And in a way, I think, you've done through this project, bringing these oral histories into a sort of new, modern take, right? On the ways that we connect these stories that have been told to us and, again, preserving them for future generations in a lot of ways. One thing that I also thought of when it came to listening to Daylight Come is the fact that, we all have stories that deserve to be documented, to be told, to be saved and preserved. And I think sometimes just sort of maybe out because of the top-down nature of history, people feel like, my family didn't do anything quote unquote remarkable, right, in history, so what's the big deal? But as I hope my listeners believe, that's completely opposite of my thinking. And so what was sort of the framework for you in thinking, these things need to be documented? Um, what are the kinds of stories that, you chose to tell and really for us to certainly be proud of? And how do you think this helps, add further context to, of course, for instance, a lot of us, hopefully most of us know about Windrush, right? But how is it that, by knowing your particular family story, how does it give us broader context about Windrush and other analogous historical events?
I agree with you that there's nothing remarkable about my family story, except I guess it's remarkable in the fact that sort of it's been put down on paper or on voice to be stored and archived. Because the thing is, if we just dismiss these family stories and say, oh, who's going to be interested? Because that was me in the beginning. I was thinking, I'm going to just do this for my sister and put it down. And then as I was digging further and further, I'm thinking, well, I should probably leave a bigger trace because of what's happening, especially today, with history being rewritten in a bad way, stories being erased. The more stories, even if they're banal, that sort of get put down with dates and times and facts, the harder it is to just sweep them away and say, oh, yeah, but it wasn't really like that, whatever. Um, So yeah, so that's the key thing. That's why I think people should be encouraged if they have an inkling to write a family story, just start doing it, put it down, and then it doesn't matter what format it takes afterwards. Put down, the trace of it, the details, and put down even stuff that may be very sensitive that you may not want someone to hear because that's your draft, your personal draft. And once it's down, then you can rework it, take out what's sensitive, maybe change names to protect people or whatever, but at least get the thing down. Because if you don't start, and that was my problem at one stage, I kept stalling. And then I realized that if I kept stalling any longer, it would never be done. And once you get into it, then you start putting the details in, you take stuff out, you rework it, it's down, and you can sort of even maybe take half of it or a quarter of it and make a smaller story than you thought you would do. But at least it's done. You can put it out there. Uh, so it's just added to that collective family storytelling.
I do want to, if I may counter a point that you make, because I do think that the story was remarkable in a lot of ways, right? You shape our understandings of Caribbean history in a particular way, especially Caribbean migration. Well, no one's migration story looks the same. I will say that first and foremost, right? I think also, depending on where your family goes, things look different, right? My family largely, to an extent, more so went to Canada and the US, right? So there are elements of this story that, of course, I know, Windrush, etc., but there were particular contexts to this that I found very interesting. They that were, maybe analogous in some ways, but also different from my own family's history. And so I think when I say remarkable, I maybe mean like people think, oh, parent wasn't in the military or my grandparent didn't become prime minister or something, right? But all of us certainly have remarkable stories to share. And I think that certainly came across in Daylight Come. Even, thinking about particular things, there is a part of Daylight Come where you're talking about your aunt's experiences, right? Particularly during World War I and World War II. And those are also things that I think add greater context to our understandings. For instance, we just recently did an episode on Caribbean people and World War I and World War II, and women's voices certainly are, not oftentimes at the top of that narrative. And so there are different ways that I think a lot of these things come to the fore through Daylight Cup. And so, sort of getting into my next question, what was it like for you to trace your lineage and connect these moments between, your personal family stories and the larger context? And what did you learn about your family and yourself in the process?
It was actually a long process because I had a lot of material, too much material to put into the final thing. So I still have a lot left. So that was also the editing process of, what do you put in? What makes it sort of interesting, engaging for the listener? And sort of, stuff that you leave out, killing your darlings kind of thing. So, not to weigh the story down. Researching the lineage was basically the information I had, some information from Anglia research that helped me connect dots of which ships, because the ships were a big deal coming over from Jamaica to the UK at the time. So, Windrush obviously was the most known, but there were many ships, often warships, that were converted as passenger ships. The history is worth looking up of the Windrush because I don't really go into it because it wasn't sort of the key thing in my Daylight Come project. But if the listeners want to explore the actual origin of that ship, I think they'll be quite stunned because there's a huge kind of background to that particular. While I was searching through the lineage, finding out, how my family came. Um, Basically, I guess learning that sort of we came from somewhere specific in Africa, which is, up until then, people would say, when I was a child, was saying, yeah, but where do you come from? Jamaica, you must have come from Africa, and Africa was this kind of generic place. And so by the research, I found out sort of the specific places in Africa where we potentially would have been taken from to be brought to the Caribbean. So that's also like a anchorage, like a connection sort of through Jamaica going further back and not just sort of you suddenly appear from Jamaica and brought to the UK. So I think that's quite important. And I've got this particular relationship with Jamaica where I've never actually been back. So I left as a child. I've got this kind of ambivalent feelings where I'll always protect Jamaica, but I have trouble with Jamaicans, so that's, it's a kind of a strange thing. And I'm not sure if that happens with other Caribbeans or immigrants that arrive. Oh, that may be just my personal kind of connection. May or may not be relevant, I don't know, but that's my particular thing with my origins. And I think maybe actually now I'm thinking about it, I never thought of it before, but maybe it was a way of protecting myself because when I arrived in the UK, I could have actually been weighed down with this kind of split of Jamaican boys grouped together, bad crowds, getting into trouble, or finding your way and breaking away from that. And so I did the latter. And so I guess it was a conscious decision. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I ended up sort of having this disconnect with Jamaica, but just to be able to move on and sort of, ending up moving to France later on and in a different kind of, political kind of evolution.
I don't know if this is maybe if I'm speaking out of turn, but I think in a lot of ways, perhaps Daylight Come was this bridge, right? To connect you to Jamaica in a lot of ways, right? I think doing this research, which um I know from personal experience can be just so laborious, right? And to turn it into something in particular, right, that you want to share, that you're hoping to craft in this way to be shared, builds a lot of bridges in some ways. And so even to that point, how are you hoping perhaps Daylight Come serves as a product that will impact future generations, whether that's in your family or, just listeners?
Well, I'm kind of going back to it because I'm currently working on a new podcast, audio essay to be more exact. And I'm thinking of returning to Daylight Come to add more study material to accompany it. So at the time when I put it out, I basically did the transcription and a timeline. So for people to sort of find their way independently of me, but just basically the story of Jamaica. And now I'm working on another story and doing more study materials. I'm thinking of going back to Daylight Come to develop accompanying materials which would be useful for future generations developing. So instead of, weighing down the story that you listen to with a lot of information that you won't remember, you can have accompanying material where you can have, say, quizzes and more engaging study material. And to sort of tying in with that, I hadn't sort of up until recently shared it with any members of my family. I felt awkward. I sort of, when I put it out, I thought, okay, my mission is done. It's out there, whatever. Shared it with friends and relations. And I felt somehow, because in the development process, I didn't ask my brothers and sisters because I didn't want to be restricted in them making comments and saying, oh, but you shouldn't really say that or whatever. I wanted to be free. So I put it out there, and time goes by. And I realized after a while, I actually didn't let any of my family listen. And one day, a niece was asking me questions about just in the UK, and I live in France, so asking me, about my life and sort of connections and family back in Jamaica. And so I'm seeing that she's curious, I shared it with her, and she was the first member. And then since then, I shared it with other members of the family. And it was interesting because she was really touched, and she said, there was so much stuff she didn't know about the family personally and about Jamaica. And she was really, touched and started sort of researching more about her family origins, connections. So I can see how it can help future generations.
Certainly, I think so as well. And, to your point on the additional sort of study materials, that's exactly sort of the impetus for my project for things like the Strictly Fact Sounds, which brings us to my next question. I'm sure, in a lot of your own views, there are things that similarly pinpoint and creatively showcase Jamaican and, Caribbean at large impact in the UK. So are there other materials? Are there other, songs, things like that that you think, also similarly document this sort of Caribbean migration story to the UK in a similar vein as Daylight Come does?
Music in general, but not really specifically. I'm just thinking really of the kind of blue beat at the time we arrived in the early 60s. And that's a whole kind of range. And I'd be hard pushed to sort of, single out specific tracks, but your listeners could really just easily search a blue beat of the early 60s, and that's a whole climate and it's kind of atmosphere, the heavy pounding beats that people were listening to. And that was a precursor to ska and reggae, which came later on. It's really, for me, it's that kind of that blue beat era and sort of one of the early that people kind of associate with his later tracks um, is Jimmy Cliff. So Jimmy Cliff, one of his big hits was Hurricane Hattie, which was a hurricane that swept through the Caribbean. And he had a massive hit with that a year later after the hurricane. And that's me, one of in the songs I associate with my mother telling me about hurricanes in the West Indies. And obviously the title of the project, Daylight Come, is from the song that Harry Belafonte made famous, the Banana Boat, Deo song.
I definitely caught that. I also thought of Andrea Levy's book, Every Light in the House Burning, sort of as like analogous material when we think of, Jamaicans migrating to the UK and, how life unfolds after the fact. So that's one that, I'll also add. But I'll definitely be sure to add Jimmy Cliff and Harry Belafonte's songs to our Strictly Fact syllabus as well.
Great.
My final question for you, what sort of do you hope for how this will inspire others? I know we talked about, how, in a sense, future generations like your niece can be impacted, but what would be maybe your advice in terms of, supporting others trying to do or hoping to do similar work to document their own family stories and really thinking about putting these stories to pen, text, audio, whatever form, and really hoping for them to preserve this for the next generation.
I guess I'd say the younger generation, one advantage they have is AI. So not to write the story, but to be kind of a companion. And so, for example, someone has a story about their grandmother from the West Indies or their family, and just to be able to start somewhere, I think AI is a really good tool. So you can either just, as recorded, that can be transcribed later, that you can build on, and just to quickly start sort of, roughing it out and laying it out so you have something you can work on. And also it's so easy today to put it online, to share the information, just essays on so many platforms that are free, which actually gets rid of the stumbling block of cost, time intensive, because all these tools help to reduce the time. And it's motivating when you can start to see your story taking shape and say you've done the first few pages or the first few minutes and you can start building and developing it. And I guess sort of, searching on the internet and seeing resources of, none of them spring to mind, but it's very easy to find people who have started putting down their family stories. Um, and not directly connected, but I'm just thinking of areas where you grow up in London or the UK and how they've changed, and thinking about how they were heavily maybe immigrant at one stage and now that's all changed, and trying to preserve the memory of, how it was in the past, tied to your family, tied to your heritage, because all that stuff changed and it's gone forever. So it's kind of trying to stamp it with your heritage in a way, if you see what I mean. So
I certainly agree. And I think, I will leave us on that point because I do definitely agree that, we can stamp our heritage, as you mentioned, in a lot of creative ways nowadays, and ways that I think, as we continue to evolve as a people, especially in this digital world and creating these linkages across time and space and oceans, right? Nations, these are important ways for us to continue to mark who we are and our legacy and imprint on the world. And so, with that, for all of our listeners tuning in, I cannot recommend Daylight Come enough. I will link it in our show notes for you all to also listen to as something in your free time alongside listening to Strictly Facts. And Calvin, I thank you and really appreciate you joining us for this podcast to talk about your project, talk about family histories, and how we continue to document family stories. And so,
thanks so
uh,
much.
of course, thank you. And, with that, till next time, little more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.